When winter came, even the stone walls would tremble. The wind would seep through the cracks in the doors. The children's breath would turn into little clouds in the darkness of the night. That year, the north winds came early. The sky seemed to have forgotten the sun for weeks. Gray clouds passed low overhead. Every morning, frost covered the fields. The birds had long since fallen silent, and the village roads had turned to stone from the mud. As people returned home with bundles of wood in their hands, the frozen ground crunched under their feet. No one spoke because the silence was a harbinger of the approaching cold. For medieval man, winter was not just a season, but a test. Hunger, frost, and disease all came at once. It tested people both physically and spiritually. Food was running low. Firewood was becoming scarce, and going into the forest required courage. In the depths of winter, the howling of wolves was not only the sound of animals, but also the sound of fear. The elders had gathered in the village square. Frost crystals had formed on the tips of their gray hair. "This year will be harsher," said one. The others nodded silently. Prayers were murmured. Fingers were crossed. In the houses, women washed pots. Children gathered small branches. As the sun set, the sky turned ash gray, and the first snowflakes made their silent descent. Everyone knew. That first snow was the beginning of a long sleep, a quick reminder. If you want to support us on our journey to 1,000 subscribers, simply subscribe to the channel. Thank you. In those days, houses weren't as warm as they are today. The walls were thin, with gaps between the stones. The wind whistled through the cracks, as if singing its own song. Windows covered with animal skins instead of glass barely let any light through. At night, your breath would hit the walls and bounce back. You could feel the cold outside, even inside the houses. That night, a mother took her children to sleep with her, because body heat was safer than a blanket. A father kept watch. If the smoke stopped coming out of the chimney, the house would freeze. If the house froze, no one would wake up in the morning. Some winters, snowstorms swept over the villages like small apocalypses. It was common to find a wall of snow in front of your door when you woke up in the morning. But people were resilient. The same ritual was repeated every morning. The men took their axes, the women set up their cauldrons, the children gathered dry branches. Life went on in this simple cycle. Once, a young man named Henrik went into the forest to gather firewood. The wind changed direction, the snow fell heavily, and the paths disappeared. For 3 days, no one heard from him. The villagers looked out their windows. They listened intently in the white silence of the snow, but no sound came. In the morning, Henrik returned. His hands were frozen, but he had a bundle of wood in his arms. Those logs kept 3 families warm. No one spoke, but everyone was grateful. That was the secret of medieval people. Endurance. Building homes from stone, wood, and hope. They knew they couldn't stop the cold outside, but they could keep the warmth inside. Every village night echoed with the distant howling of wolves. A frosty moon in the sky, sparkling snow on the ground, smoke rising from the chimneys. That smoke was a sign. Someone still lived there. Every house held a story. A cat curled up by the hearthstone in a corner. A plate of bread baked to perfection. The echo of morning prayers on the walls. The house was not just a shelter, it was resistance. The stone walls were like a prayer against the cold. People rebuilt their houses every year. If one stone was missing, the wind would blow in. If one gap was forgotten, the whole house would freeze. But those hands started anew every morning, because to live meant to start again. Women stuffed straw between the walls and hung thick fabrics over the windows. Furs were spread on the floor. The stone floor was like ice. The smell of smoke seeping from the chimney mingled with the village air, saying, "Winter has come." Some nights the wind blew so fiercely that the house creaked. But even that creaking was the sound of life. Because as long as a house didn't collapse, a village didn't die. A child trembled in his bed and asked his mother, "Mother, when will winter end?" The woman tried to smile as she replied, "When the sun warms again, my son. When the sun warms again." But until that day, the walls of that little house would listen to many storms. Every spark in the fireplace was a spark of hope. People sat silently or around the fire, watching the flames dance. In those days, fire was not just heat, it was a miracle. Because when that fire went out, the world froze. While a snowstorm raged over the village, it took courage just to knock on someone's door. Because everyone was short on firewood. Everyone's coal was precious. Despite this, on some nights, neighbors would bring soup to each other. That warm bowl was a shared hope. The cold was outside. The warmth was inside. It was in those moments that the house ceased to be just stone and wood. It beat like a heart. As time passed, people found new ways to combat the cold. They changed the angle of the chimneys. They added steeper slopes to the roofs so the snow wouldn't stick. They mixed clay into the walls. They stretched oil-soaked cloths over the windows. Every small innovation extended their survival a little longer. No one spoke of science, but in every village, a master, a craftsman, sought a way out. And one day, the village blacksmith made a new stove model. It produced less smoke and retained heat longer. For the first time, people slept through the night without shivering. The language of fire had changed. The flames no longer just burned. They told a story of life. Each crackle was like a heartbeat. Winter nights were long, but time flowed differently in those homes. Shadows roamed the walls, storms raged outside, and silence deepened inside. The children were long asleep. The women prayed quietly. The men checked the draft in the chimney. Then everyone fell silent, and only the fire spoke. And when morning came, with the first rays of sunlight falling on the snow, the houses breathed again. Smoke rose from the chimneys, chickens came out of their coops. Another day began. Because no matter how long winter lasted, mornings always gave birth anew. People knew this, so they waited patiently. Even in the midst of the cold, there was something warm in the heart of those houses. Hope. One day, spring would return. Until then, the stone walls would hold, the chimneys would smoke, the fire would not go out. The fire goes out, the wind falls silent. Dreams begin. Behind every plank, every nail, there was a frozen story. Because in that era, a house was not just a shelter, it was like a prayer. The cold was an invisible enemy circulating in the veins of medieval villages. People did not fight it. They learned to live with it. Some built stone walls, some dug into the earth, some went into the forest. With an axe in their hands and a warm dream in their hearts. Because in those days, wood was not just a material, it was a living being that spoke the language of survival. Every tree was honored with respect before being cut down. The spirit of a house is born from the heart of a tree, said the old carpenters. As the first light of dawn filtered through the mist on the northern slope of the village, a few men shouldered their axes and set off into the forest. The crunching sound of their feet on the snow echoed the heart of winter. Everyone fell silent. Only the sound of iron striking wood could be heard. Cutting down trees was both sacred and dangerous in those days. For trees held the wind. sheltered birds, and embraced the earth. To cut them down was like breaking a secret pact with nature. That's why a prayer was said after each tree. You protected us. Now we entrust you to the walls of our home. Wooden houses were born this way. First, the thick trunks were carved, then fitted together. There were no nails back then, no metal fasteners. Each piece interlocked with the other, as if they had grown together in the forest. This method continued for centuries. These were houses made by human hands, but bearing the mark of a nature. When the wind blew, the boards touched each other, and the house moved slightly. That creaking was considered the sound of peace for the villagers. They said the house was alive. It breathed with us. In villages, houses were usually built at the end of spring. Because in summer, the wood hardens, the resin dries, and it becomes more resistant to winter. The men carried the beams, the women stuffed straw between the walls, and the children kneaded the mud. In those days, the village square was like a small construction site. Everyone had their job. No one stood idle. When a house was being built, the whole village came together. Because that house was not only the pride of a family, but also of the village. A carpenter would lean over a log and count the blows of his axe. After 10 blows, the trunk would straighten. After 20, the edges would open up. After 30, it would take shape. Meanwhile, the sun would burn your face. Sweat mixed with snow, and the air smelled of resin. Each blow of the axe was like a hope. Because one day, those planks would carry the laughter of children and the crackling of fire. As the house rose, the villagers would grow quiet. When the first beam was placed, a prayer was said, and the oldest woman would place a handful of wheat on the door. "May your sustenance never be lacking," she would say. Then the first stone was placed on the doorstep, and the youngest child in the village stepped on it. Because according to their beliefs, the first step of a house must be taken with innocence. The walls of wooden houses breathed. They kept the warm air inside and pushed the cold out. The ceilings were made low so that the heat would not dissipate. The chimneys were slanted so the smoke would be drawn out by the wind. Dry grass was spread on the floor and rugs were woven on top. Every detail was part of the struggle for life. Things that seem simple to us today determined a family's fate back then. One day, a new family came to the edge of the village. A young couple. They wanted to build a house before winter set in. But wood was scarce and time was short. The whole village helped. Some carried wood, some swung pickaxes, some just prayed. In 15 days, a small house rose. When the last beam was placed on the roof, it began to snow. The young man looked at the snowflakes and smiled. "Just in time," he said. That winter, that house stood tall. In medieval villages, every house had a voice. When the wind blew, the beams groaned. When the rain fell, the roof sang. These sounds were the language of nature for the villagers. The house's voice showed that it was healthy. Silence was a disaster. Because a silent house was usually a house where the fire had gone out. The inside of wooden houses was warm but cramped. There were dry molds on the walls and smoke stains on the ceilings. A small stove burned in the middle, and everyone gathered around the fire. Women spun wool, men repaired their tools, and children listened to stories. The heart of a house was the stove. The brighter the fire burned, the more lived in the house felt. One day, the village carpenter said to his apprentice, "Building a house is easy. The hard part is keeping it warm, because warmth comes from within, not from the fire." These words were passed down through generations among the villagers, and indeed, even the strongest house would feel cold without love inside. Over time, wooden houses became part of the village's identity. Each village had different colors of wood, different patterns, and different roof slopes. Some had symbols on their beams: pilgrimage, stars, wolf heads. These served both as protection and as memories. Every scratch was a story, but there was no friend as fragile as wood. A single spark could destroy all the work. That's why barrels full of water were kept near the houses. Rainwater was collected and covered with grass to prevent it from freezing in winter. People feared fire more than cold, because fire could give life, but it could also take it away. Sometimes when a house burned down, the whole village would cry. Among the charred planks, people lost not only their belongings, but also their memories. But the next day, those same people would take up their axes again and go back to the forest, because giving up was a forgotten word in these lands. Even though the winters were harsh, there was a different kind of warmth inside the wooden houses. Even when the wind howled at night and the roofs creaked, life went on inside. Between every plank was breath, and under every beam was a prayer. In these houses, they built with their own hands. People froze and warmed, cried and laughed. But they never lost hope. One morning, as the snow began to melt, the sun seeped through the windows. Dust particles danced in the light inside the house. The children ran to the door. Outside, they heard the first bird song. The women smiled. The men stuck their axes into the ground. A new spring was coming. But everyone knew that spring would only visit the houses that remained standing. And those houses, even if made of wood, were strong enough to be talked about for centuries. Because they were built not only with manual labor, but also with heart. The fire is dying. The wind is calming down. The warm scent of wood lingered in the rooms. Dreams began. Warmth glowing in the darkness. Secret methods of keeping warm in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, winter was not just a season. It was like a silent war. The sun disappeared behind the clouds for weeks. The wind beat mercilessly even against stone walls. At night, even breathing felt like ice piercing the lungs. Yet, in the midst of this cold world, there were houses in some villages where smoke continued to rise throughout the night. These were people who had unlocked the secret to survival. They hadn't just learned to build fires. They had mastered how to preserve heat. Everything began with the floor. Today, most house floors are cold, but medieval people knew the breath of the earth, intuitively understanding how it carried warmth. That's why in some houses, the floor was built not directly on stone, but on thick wooden logs, layers of clay, and even animal hides. The layer of straw placed on the bottom layer created a natural heat barrier thanks to the air pockets. The thin layer of soil and compacted clay poured on top provided a flat surface and retained heat for a long time. Thus, the warmth of the fire lit in the morning slowly spread from the floor throughout the night, beating like the heart of the house. But the real skill lay in the hidden layers within the walls. Wall builders of that era took the direction of the cold wind into account. Walls facing the north, where the wind blew, were always built thicker. Walls facing south were made thinner so that even a little sunlight could seep in. Goat hair, wool, and sometimes even dried seaweed were usually packed into the interior of the walls. These materials both retained heat and absorbed moisture. Each house exuded a different scent of warmth, a mixture of wool, wood smoke, and a hint of earth. It was the scent of protection from the cold. Ceilings were made low, because high ceilings carry warm air upwards. People did not want the heat to be trapped above their heads. That's why ceilings in medieval houses were almost low enough to touch. Moreover, dried grass was stuffed between the ceiling beams. This further reinforced the insulation. Each layer is the product of a life experience. Because surviving a winter was not just about enduring. It required thinking, planning, and understanding nature. And of course, the hearth was the center of everything. It was not just a pile of stones, but humanity's oldest miracle. Gathering around the fire was not just about warming up, but about feeling alive. However, keeping the fire burning was as much an art as lighting it. Wood was not easy to find in those days. The forests belonged to the lords. Cutting down trees was punishable. Therefore, the villagers did not completely extinguish the fire in the morning. They covered the embers left over from the night with ashes, and in the morning, they revived them by blowing on them again. This was called the eternal fire. It was believed that if a home's hearth never went out, prosperity and peace would always reign there. In some regions, especially in the Northeast, hearths were not made of stone, but of a mixture of clay and straw. This special mixture retained heat as well as stone, but cooled much more slowly. Even after the fire went out in the evening, the clay bricks around the hearth remained warm until morning. When women got up early in the morning, they would sit on these stones to warm their children. The cold might scorch you from the outside, but inside, it was overcome by the silent power of the fire. The warmth in the house was shared not only by the fire, but also by bodies. There was no such thing as individual living for people in those days. Families, and sometimes even neighbors, slept in the same room. This was not only a matter of solidarity, but also a direct method of heating. The heat from multiple bodies could raise the temperature in a small room by several degrees. That's why children, the elderly, and animals were usually under the same roof. It was not considered strange for chickens, goats, and even lambs to live in a corner of the house. They were both part of life and protective friends against the cold. Windows were the most dangerous point for heat loss. Glass was a luxury reserved for the nobility. Peasants usually cover their windows with animal skins. A thin goat skin let light in but blocked the wind. In some places, sheep stomach membranes treated with oil were even used as window coverings. This protected the warm air inside and blocked the sharp wind from outside. Sitting in front of such a window and watching the glow of the fire was considered a luxury at that time. Peasants calculated not only the interior of their homes, but also how the wind came from outside. Windbreaks, piles of wood, or small earthen embankments were often placed in front of houses. This way, the direction of the wind was broken, and it did not hit the walls of the house directly. In some areas, bushes were even planted around the houses. These bushes both slowed down the wind and protected the house by holding snow drifts in certain places. Nature was not an enemy. When listened to correctly, it was the strongest ally. At night, silence fell, and while the wind howled on the roofs, only the crackling of wood could be heard inside. People would sit by the fire, stretch out their hands, and keep their eyes half closed. This moment was a symbol of both peace and fatigue. Women would knit wool, men would repair their tools, children would quietly huddle together, and every breath would mix with the smell of wood and warm air. The house was not just a shelter, but like a small world. This was the miracle of medieval man, to manage to preserve light and warmth even in the darkness of winter. There was wisdom in every stone, under every plank, because for them, warming up was not about conquering nature, but about coming to terms with it. Even when the embers of the fire died down, a warmth always remained in those houses, in the walls, in the grain of the wood, in people's hands. And that warmth became a story to be told for centuries to come. Winter nights in medieval villages were filled not only with cold, but also with silence. While the wind howled on the roof beams outside, the only sound rising from the village was the crackling of the hearths. But that fire was not just a source of heat. It was a meaning. For people, fire was a gift from God, a piece taken from the sky. They believed that within every spark was the breath of life, a sacred vibration. That is why sitting around the fire was not just about warming up. It was a kind of prayer. People gathered around the fire would fall silent. Watching the movement of the flames, it was believed that the spirits lost in the past danced there. Some villagers said that on winter nights, those who gazed into the fire for a long time could hear the voices of the old world. Some saw this voice as the whisper of the gods, others as a protective message from the spirits of their ancestors. That is why, when the first fire of winter was lit, everyone remained silent. They listened only to the sounds made by the fire, because that sound was the oldest language between humans and nature. The task of lighting the fire usually fell to the oldest or wisest member of the family. It didn't matter if they were male or female. What mattered was the purity of the spirit. Before starting the fire, a few drops of water were sprinkled in front of the hearth. This water was a symbol of peace made with the cold. Then, as the wood was arranged, short prayers were murmured over each piece. They would say, "Burn without breaking, heat without blazing." Because if the fire was not restrained, it meant disaster. If controlled, it meant life. In some houses in the villages, there was a small stone niche just above the hearth. In this niche, there would be an old piece of iron, sometimes a burnt piece of wood, sometimes a stone kept with prayers. People believed these stones protected the fire from the evil eye. If the fire went out, it was a bad sign. It meant not only the cold, but also bad luck had entered the house. That's why the woman of the house would check the hearth first thing every morning. If the embers were still glowing, it was said the day would be a good one. In some villages, there was a tradition called the fire watch, held on the longest night of winter. All the villagers would light a huge fire in the village square and gather around it with torches in their hands. Everyone would bring a small piece of wood with them. They would silently make a wish as they threw it into the fire. The flames rising to the sky signaled that their wishes had reached God. However, the real purpose of this ceremony was to call the sun. This was because the long winter nights were seen as a reflection of the sun's wrath. Lighting a fire was a way of saying, "We haven't forgotten you." The village children were the most enchanted on these nights. They said they saw shapes in the flames. They described sometimes seeing a knight's armor, sometimes an angel's wing. The elders smiled but shook their heads seriously. They said the fire knew what to show to whom. This belief conveyed that fire was not just an element, but a symbol of wisdom. Villagers attributed meaning to the sound of the fire. If the wood crackled and popped, it was said that a guest would come. If it burned quietly, there was peace in the house. If the smoke did not come out of the chimney properly and filled the room, it was believed to be a bad omen. Usually someone would fall ill. For this reason, the hearths were always kept clean, and the ashes were removed regularly. Some women would even take a handful of ashes from the fireplace and scatter them in the corners of the house on the first morning of the new year. Conversations around the fire, saying, "Don't let the cold come here," were also part of the ritual. It was believed that every word spoken at that moment would mix with the flames and rise to the sky. That's why no one spoke ill. Curses or anger would inflame the fire. It was even said that sometimes when someone with bad intentions came to the house, the fire would notice. If the flame suddenly crackled and black smoke rose from the chimney, the owner of the house would immediately sprinkle holy water to calm the fire, because the anger of the hearth was the anger of the house. In some regions, especially in mountain villages, there was a widespread belief in the spirit of the hearth. This spirit was called Evana, or the fearful woman. It was believed that an invisible being lived inside every house. If the homeowners were respectful to each other, the children were well behaved, and the tables were bountiful, Evana would be happy and keep the fire alive. However, quarrels, jealousy, or cursing would scare that spirit away. In a house where Evan had left, the hearth would go out, food would burn quickly, and the stove would not heat. For this reason, women would sometimes sit quietly by the hearth at night, murmuring, "Don't go." Even on the darkest days of winter, the minutes spent in front of the fire gave people hope. Because even if there was a storm outside, there was a glow inside. This glow was a symbol of the resistance within people. The fire seemed to whisper to them, "Freeze, forget, wait." Spring would come, and that they would wake up with each new morning. Sometimes the village's old priest would go around the houses at night and say prayers. But even the priest knew that the real prayer was in the fire. The silence within the flames was holier than any words. That's why the villagers wouldn't sleep without extinguishing the fire. Sometimes someone would wake up in the middle of the night. They would stir the embers with a shovel, making the spark a little more alive. This was both a habit and a ritual. The warmth of the hearth penetrated people's hearts. It was not the body, but the soul that warmed there. In the light of the flames, people would gather, tell stories, and smile quietly. Because that light was humanity's first victory over darkness. Winter was sometimes a test not for the individual, but for the community. The walls of a single house could perhaps keep out the cold. But when the storm lasted long, even those walls had their limits. The villages of Ortag had learned this through bitter experience. Every year, snow swallowed the fields, blocked the roads, and severed the connection between the forests and the villages. For days, weeks, no one could go outside. So people found a solution. Large firehouses. These houses were located in the heart of the village. They were usually stone-based, thick-walled structures with a single window. Inside was a large central hearth. It was so big that it was almost deep enough for a person to fit inside. Every evening, the people gathered around this hearth, sharing their wood, their stories, and their hopes. The firehouse was not just a shelter, but the embodiment of a spirit of unity. The village elders described the first lighting of the great firehouse as a sacred moment. They said that on that day, the village became a family, because the cold was the same for everyone there. No one was warmer than anyone else. No one was left outside. The fire was the shared heart of the village. No matter what quarrel broke out in which house, no matter which family had a disagreement with whom, everyone was equal around the great fire. The spark of the hearth lit the same glow on every person's face. Firehouses were usually long and rectangular in shape. Stones were placed at the bottom of the walls and thick logs at the top. The roofs were sloped and covered with thick straw. This straw not only blocked rain and snow, but also muffled the sound. When the wind blew, only the sound of the fire could be heard inside. The smoke rose not from the chimney, but from a large hole in the middle of the ceiling. This hole was also a window through which the stars could be seen. In some villages, the first light filtering through this hole was called the breath of God. The warmth permeated everything inside. As the stones heated up, a warm mist rose from the walls. The women lined up the soup pots they had brought from their homes around the hearth. The men carried in the wood they had gathered throughout the day, one after another. Even conversations were different in the house of fire. Slower, deeper, more human. Because everyone knew that every word spoken there touched someone else's heart. Some nights, storytellers would appear around the fire. They were the memory of the village. Throughout the winter, it wasn't just the fire that warmed everyone's hearts, but also the stories that were told. A storyteller would wait for the crackling of the burning wood, then begin. Once upon a time, there was a mountain where the snow never melted, and the villagers would stare into the flames, forgetting the sound of the snowstorm outside. Young children would drift in and out of sleep, lost in those stories. The fire warmed not only the body, but also the imagination. In some villages, dried herbs, sacred symbols, and animal horns were hung on the walls of these houses. These were signs of both fertility and protection. On the first day of each new year, the village elder would throw 3 pieces of wood into the hearth. One for the past, one for the present, and one for the future. This ritual was to ensure the fire would protect the village for another year. Everyone fell silent at that moment, watching the flames rise. Because the higher the flames, the shorter the winter would be. In the great firehouse, everyone had a role. Children carried wood. Young people kept the fire burning. The elders prayed. The women cooked. The men listened to the wind outside. In these moments of silence, the villagers would talk without looking at each other. The light of the flames changed their faces. There was a tired but peaceful glow in their eyes. Outside, the snowstorm raged. But inside, the people enjoyed the silence together. But the great firehouse was not just a shelter. It was also the place for news, decisions, and justice. The village leader or priest would gather here to resolve disputes, because no one could lie in front of the fire. They said, "The flame reveals the truth." That's why making a promise in front of the fire was the strongest oath. If someone broke that promise, it was believed that their hearth would go out the following winter. In some regions, firehouses were considered a sanctuary, even in times of war. If the enemy raided the village, women and children would take refuge here. The stone walls were difficult to destroy, and the heat inside the fire was maintained for a long time. That's why the people called the firehouse the living heart. The village could burn, the fields could be destroyed, but if the fire remained, the village would be reborn. At night, everyone's hands were filled with the same warmth. As people drew closer to each other, the ice between them melted. Quarrels, grudges, and resentments were forgotten beside the fire, because the fire painted them all the same color, red and warm. In those houses, there were no rich, no poor, no strong, no weak. There were only people. People who shared the same warmth, who listened to the same silence. And when morning came, the first light would filter through the opening in the ceiling, creating a faint glow on the soot layer on the walls. At that moment, the village would breathe again. Outside, there was snow. Inside, there was life. That great hearth was not just stone and wood. It was a symbol of solidarity, of waiting with hope. That's how humanity learned to conquer winter. Not with solid walls, but by coming together and sharing the same fire. The warmth beneath the stone, underfloor heating, and smart architecture. Winter in medieval villages was not just a season, it was a silent force, a test that encompassed all of life. Snow swallowed fields, blocked roads, and settled on stone walls. When people looked outside, they saw not just a white blanket, but the silent vigil of an enemy. But fighting the cold wasn't just about lighting fires. When combined with intelligence, patience, and observation, people learned to cope with the cold. The wisest craftsmen in the village did not just think about the walls and the roof. They also used the floor as a weapon, because throughout the night, the cold rose from beneath the ground. When you pressed your feet to the floor, you could feel the ice permeating every cell. And that is why, in the Middle Ages, a secret heating system was built in some houses. This was the hypocaust, or underfloor heating method. This method was not only to block the cold, but also to make life comfortable and safe. It was used in large mansions, monasteries, and wealthy castles. Narrow tunnels and brick supports were built under rooms with stone exteriors. These tunnels spread out like a labyrinth under the ground. Hot air from small furnaces passed through here, heating the stones. It then exited through the chimney. Thus, the floor of the room remained warm all day long, despite being covered with snow and ice outside. Peasants adapted this system to their own means. Instead of large stones, they used bricks and compressed clay. In some houses, hot coal and ash were laid on the lower layers. Pots were placed between the stones. These pots trapped the heat throughout the day, becoming a source of gentle warmth that spread throughout the room at night. Children could walk barefoot on the stone floor, play, and run around without feeling cold. But the hypocaust was not just an engineering marvel. It was also a ritual that shaped life. The channels under the floor controlled the direction of the air and the flow of heat, absorbing moisture from the walls. The walls were protected from dampness. Stone and clay slowly stored heat throughout the day. The fire lit in the early evening hours warmed not only people but also the stones, clay walls, underground channels, and the air in the room. This chain reaction was like a system forming the heart of the house. Each element complemented the other. Villagers developed these methods through observation and experience. Walls were built thicker on whichever side the north wind blew. More stone layers were placed there. The south facade was kept thinner. Sunlight could filter in. Ceiling beams were made low. Warm air circulated in the room without escaping upwards. Windows were small and deeply recessed. Animal skin or oiled fabric was used instead of glass. This blocked the cold while letting in light. These methods created both physical and spiritual warmth, because warmth protected not only the body, but also the soul. The most important aspect of the underground system was that it shaped social life. Families in the village had to share the warmth of the rooms. No one could warm themselves alone. Everyone's presence increased the efficiency of the system. Children ran around the rooms while the elderly waited by the stove. Women cooked, men carried wood, and the whole village worked like a small organism. Everyone's movement was directly proportional to the balance of warmth. The hypocaust system did not only work inside homes. In some villages, was also applied under roads, churches, and even monastery rooms. This kept all the living spaces of the villagers warm throughout the winter, preventing the cold from dampening their spirits. This method was a convergence of engineering, observation of nature, and human ingenuity. Every stone, every brick, every channel was the result of a learned lesson. When night fell and the snowstorm raged outside, the villagers sat quietly inside. The stone floor was warm, the rooms comfortable, the fire burning until morning. Women knitted wool silently, children rolled on the floor. Men silently checked the stones next to the oven. Every breath was filled with the scent of wood and warm air. This meant not only survival, but celebration of life. The Stiller family observed the system every time a new house was built, corrected any flaws, and passed the knowledge on to the next generation. Because in the Middle Ages, losing knowledge meant losing the winter for a family. Every stone, every brick, was not just a physical structure. It was a guarantee left for future generations. And thus, thanks to the underground systems, the villages did more than just survive. They learned to channel the cold like a friend. Human intellect and patience combined with stone and earth made life sustainable. No matter how long the winter lasted, the villagers knew that the warmth beneath the stone was always with them. Even if snow and ice froze everything outside, inside, warmth, patience, and intellect were united. Humanity created such a miracle, not to defeat the cold, but to understand and direct it. The ground is warm, the stones breathe, the rooms fill with silence. The snowstorm rages outside, but we are warm and safe here. Dreams begin with the warm hands of artisans, bakers, blacksmiths, and potters. When winter descended on the village, the snow and cold froze not only the houses, but also the human spirit. Every breath mingled with white vapor. Even breathing became a small struggle. But the villagers knew that survival was not just about heating the walls and floors. The warmth created by human hands was a miracle beyond the fire. That miracle was hidden in the hands of the craftsmen. When a new house was built, the masters would observe the system, correct any flaws, and pass the knowledge on to the apprentice. Because in the Middle Ages, losing knowledge meant losing the winter for a family. Every brick was not just a physical structure. It was a guarantee left to future generations. And thus, thanks to the underground systems, villages not only survived, but learned to channel the cold like a friend. Human intellect and patience combined stone and earth to make life sustainable. No matter how long the winter lasted, the villagers knew that the warmth beneath the stone was always with them. Even if snow and ice froze everything outside, inside, warmth, patience, and intellect were united. Humanity created such a miracle, not to defeat the cold, but to understand and harness it. The ground is warm, the stones breathe, the rooms fill with silence. The snowstorm raged outside, but we were warm and safe here. Dreams began. From the warm hands of artisans, bakers, blacksmiths, and potters. When winter descended on the village, the snow and cold froze not only the houses, but also the human spirit. Every breath mingled with white vapor. Even breathing became a small struggle. But the villagers knew that survival was not just about heating the walls and floors. The warmth created by human hands was a miracle beyond the fire. That miracle was hidden in the hands of the artisans. At night, a small ritual began in the village square. The craftsmen would warm their hands by the fire, exchange a few words with each other, and silently check their work. The baker would test the temperature of the stone-based oven, check the consistency of the dough, and add new wood. The blacksmith would check the heat of the hammered metals and carefully carry the red-hot iron out of the oven. The potter would open the kiln door, observe the surface of the pots, and check for cracks. Every movement was vital for both the continuity of the work and the warmth of the village. On the longest nights of winter, the artisans passed on their knowledge and skills to each other. The blacksmiths gathered in the kilnmaster's room. The potters watched them quietly. Small discussions took place. Knowledge was shared about how to place a stone, how to arrange the wood, what consistency the clay should be. Because the survival of the entire village throughout the winter depended on the manual skills of these masters. Some nights, the elderly craftsmen would tell stories. They would say, "The cold is such an enemy that fire alone is not enough. It requires intelligence, patience, and the spirit of the work." As the children warmed their hands by the fire, they intuitively grasped the meaning of these words. Each apprentice engraved that night in their memory, learning the knowledge necessary to manage the cold in the future. The craftsmen's hands created the warmth of the village and at the same time laid the foundation for social order. Every oven, every stove, every pottery was a story of a village. It was proof of an order in which people could live together. The hours spent around the fire were not just work, but a kind of meditation, a ritual, and a security system. People knew that without the craftsman's labor, stone, walls, and underground systems alone would not suffice. No matter how long the winter lasted, the warmth in the craftsman's hands kept the heart of the village alive. There was hope for life in every slice of bread, every piece of hammered iron, every baked pottery. This hope served as the strongest protective shield against the snowstorm outside. When silence fell at midnight, the sparks of the fire rose. Stone and brick glowed with a warm light, and the villagers slowly sank into silence. The artisans warmed their hands one last time and left their work to prepare for the next day. Every breath reminded them of both warmth and the value of human labor. Thus, in the hands of the artisans, the village not only survived, but also gained the knowledge to understand and manage the cold. The baker, blacksmith, and potter did not just do their jobs. They forged an invisible bond for the village's safety, prosperity, and future. While snow and cold continued outside, warmth and life flowed rhythmically within the village. Flames in our hands, stones in our hearts. No matter how long the snow fell, we were warm and safe here. Wait for the night, feel the morning, let the dreams begin. Winter's silent rituals, social bonds, and daily life. On the coldest days of winter, the snow covered not only the houses, but also the heart of the village. While the wind howled outside and covered the roads, the villagers huddled together inside. They breathed with a quiet but powerful sense of togetherness. The warmth that came from the hands of the craftsmen warmed not only the body, but also the social spirit. Every loaf of bread, every piece of hammered iron, and every baked pottery was a silent testament to the village's collective existence. With the first light of dawn, the village awoke. People would check the warmth of their homes. Everyone passing by the large fire in front of the houses would feel the comfort inside after the cold outside. Children would run quietly in the streets, rubbing their hands together, raising their voices as they moved from one game to another, such as, the elderly would look out the window, watch the silence of the snow, and appreciate the warmth inside once again. Women continued their silent rituals amid their daily chores. Every movement, carrying wood, checking the oven, kneading dough, created an order, a rhythm. This rhythm not only made work easier, but also set the pace of village life. Over time, everyone adapted to the rhythm of winter. No matter how harsh the snow-covered outside world became, the order inside remained unbroken. At night, community members gathered in the large firehouse or around the artisans' ovens. Here, a silent ritual began. People came together not only to talk, but to feel each other's presence. Everyone combined their own warmth with that of others, forming a silent bond. Sometimes a storyteller would emerge. He would share stories from ancient times, tales of wars, famines, and the hardships of cold weather. Listeners would close their eyes in the flickering light of the flames and lose themselves in the story. Some nights, the village youth and children would play quiet games around the fire. These games were not just for fun. They offered a small rehearsal for learning, community harmony, and solidarity. Each child learned to respect another's space, to take turns, to share silence together. These rituals were invisible threads that held people together in the face of winter's harshness. For the elders, this silence was a moment to pass on wisdom. A few words, a few signs, a glance were enough. Children and young people grew up within this silent ritual. They intuitively grasped the norms of the community. Every movement, every breath was a way of coping with the harshness of winter. Thanks to this, conflict was rare in the village. People warmed themselves with each other's presence and did not remain alone in the cold. The hands of the baker, the blacksmith, and the potter were the invisible engines of this social ritual. As the bread from the oven was shared, as the iron doors and pot lids forged by the blacksmith began to be used, as the pots fired by the potter took their place on the tables, every individual in the village felt the warmth of solidarity and labor. The community moved as one body against the cold. Some rituals in the village had a special meaning. For example, the fire lit together when the first snow fell in winter was dedicated to the village's guardian spirit. People gathered silently around this fire, warming their hands, whispering their wishes. This ritual was not just an individual habit, but a social bond. People remembered that they stood together despite the cold. Families also maintained a silent ritual while sharing their meals. The oldest member of the household would cut the bread. Everyone would take a piece in turn and extend their hand with a small thank you. These small gestures were part of the solidarity that lasted throughout the winter. The silence was just a wordless agreement. It was the silent language of warmth and security. For the village children, this ritual was a natural way of learning. Every glance, every touch, every breath taught the meaning of being together and enduring the cold. As the children grew up, they understood the value of these silent rituals and passed them on to their own families. Thus, knowledge and habits gained continuity across generations. At night, silence reigned in the village, while the light of the fire reflected on the stones, walls, and rooms. People spent the night within this light and warmth, hearing their own breaths without feeling the power of the cold. Each breath warmed both the body and the soul. It reminded people that they were connected to each other, consciously or unconsciously. Sometimes the snowstorm was so fierce that no sound could be heard outside. But the silent ritual inside the village continued. People felt the warmth of the fire and each other, finding security and peace within the small community. Even in the harshest moments of winter, this silence became a protective shield. It bound people to the value of living together. And when morning came, as the first light seeped through the windows, the village would wake up again. Covered in the silent blanket of snow, people would start the new day having felt each other's presence throughout the night, having felt the spirit of community. The warmth from the artisans' hands, the spark of the fire, and the silent rituals kept the village alive, becoming a shield against the cold. There is a rhythm in the silence, warmth in our hands, living together in our breath. No matter how long the snow outside lasts, we are one here. In winter, children and young people play, learn, and live their daily lives. Winter had quietly settled into every corner of the village, covering the roads with snow and bending the tree branches. But for children and young people, this was not just an obstacle. It was also a playground. The silence of the snow softened every step and muffled every sound, like a blanket falling over the village. Even if the wind howled outside and blocked the roads, the warmth inside the village and the craftsmen's hard work meant that children could move around safely. Young children would wake up in the morning, put on their thick clothes, and run along the snow-covered paths to the bakery or the large firehouse. They carried small bags in their hands, filled with stones, wood, or pieces of baked bread. This was not just a game. It was also their first lesson in responsibility, sharing, and cooperation. The children felt the warmth of the home and the wood-fired oven, the artisans' manual labor, and learned how every action contributed to the order of the village. Young people were trained alongside the artisans during the long winter nights. They would sit next to the baker. They would learn the consistency of the dough, how to control the fire, and how stone-based ovens worked. Next to the blacksmith, they would watch the hammer blows and learn to gauge the heat of the iron, learning to use their hands with confidence. Working alongside the potter, they kneaded clay, shaped it, put it in the kiln, and understood how even the cold affected the materials. Every touch, every observation was engraved on the young people's conscious hands. Winter games were not just entertainment, but also a natural way of learning. Children learned balance by following footsteps in the snow, patience by sliding in turn, and community awareness by moving together. Snowball fights, ice skating games, and snow tunnels were rituals that developed both physical skills and group coordination. These games were a quiet but powerful educational space. No matter how cold the snow was, the warmth and togetherness inside meant children grew up in a safe environment. Families watched over their children's games, guiding them to safe areas. Young people gathered around the big fire in the house or near the ovens, continuing the silent rituals, warming their hands, quietly learning from each other. These rituals ensured the survival of children and young people and their place in the community, no matter how fierce the cold wind outside. On long winter nights, families and villagers would tell stories with their children, passing on the wisdom of the past. Fairy tales, legends, stories of war and famine created both excitement and wisdom in the minds of children. Children lost themselves in the stories, using their imaginations in the flickering light of the fire, forgetting the dark and cold outside world. This served as both entertainment and a kind of mental heater. Although their reading and writing skills were limited, children were equipped with practical knowledge. Craftsmen's handiwork, family household management, wood gathering, animal care, and food preparation were skills learned at a young age. Every movement, every task formed a preparation, a strategy against the harshness of winter. While acquiring these skills, young people gained both physical and mental resilience. A silent solidarity developed among children and young people throughout the winter. If one was cold, another would offer a hand. If one fell, another would rush to help. This was not merely an individual reflex, but a natural manifestation of community spirit. The challenges of snow and cold forced them to act together, strengthening trust and friendship. When evening came, the villagers gathered around the fire and welcomed the young people and children to join them. The silent ritual continued. Hands warmed, faces glowed in the light of the flames. Children, young people, and adults shared the silence and warmth together, forming a united front against the harshness of winter. These rituals were necessary not only for survival, but also for shaping the village's future. And in the quietest moment of the night, while the snowstorm howled outside, the children and young people drifted off into their dreams inside. Every breath mingled with the warmth of the fire. Hands and feet relaxed. The mind continued to learn in silence. No matter how long the winter lasted, the community, the craftsman's labor, the family, no matter how much snow fell, we were together. Our hands were warm. Our hearts were together. Let the dreams begin. The first light of spring, the end of winter, and rebirth continue. Winter settled over the village for months, covering the roads with snow, freezing the fields, enveloping everything like a silent and heavy blanket, while the people living inside were in silent resistance. Hands joined together in the great fires of their homes, and the village's heart was kept warm by the labor of the baker, the blacksmith, and the potter. Children continued their games, young and old alike carried on their rituals. Though winter's harshness seemed to wear the village down, this long and silent struggle forged a deep bond within the community. As the first rays of spring slowly began to filter through the horizon, the white blanket of snow gave way to damp earth and the first hints of green. The days grew longer, the sun warmer, the air lighter. People watched the snow melt by the windows in the mornings, felt the warmth beneath the stone floors, and intuitively sensed life beginning anew. It was both a physical and spiritual awakening. The patience, cooperation, and solidarity they had learned throughout the winter were rewarded with the first rays of spring. After a long winter of silence and patience in the village square, people slowly began to venture outside. Children ran on the snow-melted roads, noticed the small flowers along the paths, and reached out their hands to each other. This was not just a game. After months of introspection and silence during winter, it was a rebirth that reminded them how precious life was. The baker lit his oven early in the morning and felt that the stone floors were still slightly warm. These warm stones were a reminder of the heat stored throughout the winter and were ready to bake new bread with the arrival of spring. The blacksmith would rekindle the flames in his workshop and hammer new iron, gleaming in the first rays of spring sunshine. Each hammer blow symbolized the hope and vitality that followed the snow and cold. The potter cleaned the kilns, shaped new pots, and watched the earth and clay merge with the spring sun. These masters transferred what they had learned during the winter to the village's rebirth in spring. Another ritual began in the great firehouse. After spending months together during the winter, people gathered around the fire again to warm their hands. But this time, the silence was different. It was not only the silence of survival, but also the joy of life and rebirth. People looked at each other and noticed the tired but hopeful light in their eyes. Children played quietly. Young people helped each other, while the elderly watched over the future of the village. All the rituals in the village, the craftsman's labor, the family's attention, and the children's learning gained meaning with the first rays of spring. The melting of the snow, the revival of the fields and gardens, and the renewed movement of the animals restarted the village's cycle of life. People combined the solidarity and patience they had learned during the winter with the energy brought by spring and celebrated the value of life. The lessons of silence, warmth, and togetherness learned during the winter became visible in every corner of the village with the arrival of spring. The day that began in the house spread to the fields, the bakery, the workshops, and the homes. Every movement, every breath became part of the village's revival. As people watched the snow melt, they understood that the hardships of winter were merely a preparation period. and renewed their hopes for the future. Children, playing in the melted snow for the first time, would quietly hold each other's hands, feeling the confidence of having learned to stand together against the cold. Young people would begin to use what they had learned from the craftsmen for the tasks of spring, contributing to the reshaping of the village. The elders would remember the hardships of the past winter and share their wisdom with the light that spring brought. The village square turned into a quiet celebration area. People looked at each other, silently warming their hands, feeling the value of community spirit and solidarity. This celebration was not a big festival, but a quiet and profound moment of happiness. The long silence and hardships of winter were rewarded with the first rays of spring. And at the end of the day, as the sun set on the horizon, the villagers returned to their homes, feeling the warmth beneath their stone floors. They sat with their families and shared their evening meal. Children slowly closed their eyes, young people warmed their hands, and the elderly smiled quietly. Everyone found a balance between the harshness of winter and the renewing power of spring, quietly drifting into dreams. The snow melts, the light comes. We are here. Our hands are warm, our hearts are together. The village is reborn. Let the dreams begin. Thus, while winter tested the village with its cold and silence, spring reborn the village with warmth, hope, and community spirit. People learned. Overcoming the cold was possible not only with fire, but also with patience, unity, and skilled labor. The village is reaping the rewards of what it learned throughout the year. Every stone, every breath, and every smile was coming back to life, finding warmth within the cold. Dear viewers, at the end of this long journey, we witnessed together the freezing winters of the Middle Ages and the ways of life that people developed to protect themselves from these winters. Every stone, every brick, every oven, every pot, and every silent ritual was not only proof of survival, but also of human intelligence, patience, and community spirit. Consider this. Every flake of snow was a struggle, every gust of wind a test. Yet, within all this cold, people clung to each other, making life possible. The warmth inside did not come solely from the fire. It sprang from the hands of the craftsmen, the patience of the artisans, the determination of families to stay together, and the solidarity children learned through play. The warm stones beneath the ground, the smoke rising from the oven, the blacksmith's fire, and the potter's clay were symbols.